También contamos con un montón de invitados, agradecemos a los oficiales y personal civil de CAICOPAZ, que es el Centro de Entrenamiento Conjunto de Operaciones de Paz, que cuando vieron que íbamos a tocar esta temática desde el lado académico, les interesó mucho esta cuestión, y desde ya agradecemos a nuestra invitada también especial de hoy, que nos va a hablar sobre los aspectos académicos, desde un abordaje académico, de una investigación que ella hizo en el Congo y en Haití, sobre las percepciones y la cuestión de SEA, de Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, de abuso y explotación sexual, en misiones de paz, en las misiones de MINUSTAH y en el Congo. Ella es la doctora Susan Bartels, que ahora en un ratito la voy a presentar. Thank you, Susan. Ella va a disertar en un idioma inglés, espero que todos entiendan, si no vamos a también tener posibilidades de hacerlo despacio, y si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, nosotros vamos a hacer la interpretación también de las respuestas de ella. Vamos a iniciar entonces esta sesión con una introducción de esto que tiene que ver con abuso y explotación sexual en las misiones de paz. Esto desde el año 2000, más o menos, tuvimos dos documentos muy importantes que fueron el informe Brahimi y la resolución 1325. Del 2000 a esta parte, 20 años después, hemos aprendido un montón, hemos tenido un montón de lecciones aprendidas en términos de best practices en misiones de paz, no solo en la parte operativa, logística, financiera, de recursos humanos, pero también de los códigos de conducta que tienen que estar muy presentes a la hora de desplegar una misión de paz y a la hora de instruir a los miembros, tanto hombres y mujeres, que van a desarrollar y que van a representar no solo a un país, sino también van a estar bajo la bandera de Naciones Unidas. Nosotros, y esto lo digo desde un lado personal, somos académicos que velamos por la cooperación internacional en estas cuestiones, o sea que somos grandes defensores de las Naciones Unidas y de las misiones de paz, pero como grandes defensores también ponemos la clave y ponemos el ojo en las críticas y en las lecciones aprendidas que nosotros tenemos que ver para mejorar, y cómo la academia puede también representar un puente de intersección para llevar estos temas a la práctica, la ejecución, la formación y el entrenamiento. Como saben, estos ciclos son 3 encuentros. En el encuentro de hoy va a estar la licenciada Denise Ambiti y la doctora Susan Bartels, hablando desde un lado académico de la cuestión abuso y explotación sexual en misiones de paz. El miércoles que viene, a las 11, ojo que no va a ser a las 10, sino a las 11, van a estar representantes de ONU Mujeres, hablando de la resolución 1325, representantes de nuestra Cancillería Argentina, de la Dirección de Mujeres de la Cancillería Argentina, hablando sobre también el plan de implementación, el segundo plan de implementación de la 1325. I'm sorry, Susan, that I'm going too fast, and in Spanish. Y después, el próximo miércoles también va a estar la jefa de Código y Conducta de Naciones Unidas del Departamento de Operaciones de Paz de Naciones Unidas, la doctora Beth Asher, que es una ídola en todo lo que tiene que ver con la prevención, la ejecución y las sanciones en cuanto a los países contribuyentes de tropa que tienen todavía cuestiones pendientes y abiertas de SEA. Y también vamos a tener como invitada especial a la directora de Políticas de Género del Ministerio de Defensa, la doctora Laura Mazón. Como ven, el miércoles que viene tenemos bien el foco en la gestión nacional e internacional para prevenir este tipo de delitos y este tipo de conductas. En la tercera sesión, que va a ser el miércoles 26 de mayo, vamos a tener a 2 invitadas muy especiales. Una es la representante, la alta representante de Naciones Unidas para la protección a las víctimas, que es Jane Connor, que también va a dar su exposición en inglés. Jane Connor trabaja en Naciones Unidas específicamente desde la cuestión de la protección a las víctimas y cómo las Naciones Unidas asume la cuestión de protección a las víctimas en relación a abuso y explotación sexual. Y también vamos a tener a una doctora, a una abogada brasileña, que es la oficial, que se llama Carla Loque, que es la oficial encargada del tema de SEA en MINUSTA, que trabaja en asistencia a las víctimas en terreno. O sea que también ahí vamos a tener cómo las Naciones Unidas enfoca este tema de proteger a las víctimas y también cómo las Naciones Unidas operacionaliza la protección a las víctimas y cómo es el link entre las víctimas, las Naciones Unidas y los países contribuyentes de tropa y cómo nosotros desde la academia podemos empezar a unir todos estos tres grandes ciclos y estos tres elementos tan importantes. Quiero dejar de acaparar la atención y quiero darle ya la palabra a Denise Zambiti. De vuelta a agradecer la presencia de la doctora Susan Bartels, que hizo un gran y extenso estudio, y a todos y a todas las que están presentes, especialmente a aquellos oficiales, suboficiales, instructores y personal civil del CAICOPAS que se dedican a esto y que pretendemos que esto sea solo un granito de arena desde el CEPI para poder interactuar y dar profundidad a esta temática que tanto nos empuja a seguir creyendo que las misiones de paz y sabiendo que las misiones de paz se pueden fortalecer desde distintos lugares, tanto desde la gestión, desde lo internacional y desde la academia. Así que muchísimas gracias, y con esto voy a presentar a Denise. Denise es nuestra coordinadora de, como les conté, el Observatorio de Mujeres y Diversidades. Ella es licenciada en Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Hizo 3 diplomaturas de asistencia humanitaria en temas de conflictos armados, en temas de catástrofes naturales, y la 3ª diplomatura, asistencia humanitaria en desplazamiento forzado de población. Ella está haciendo hoy por hoy una maestría en cuestiones de género y trabaja en la Auditoría General de la Ciudad de Buenos Aires, que creo, si no me equivoco, y es también docente ayudante de la materia de Relaciones Exteriores en la cátedra de Juan Pablo Laporte. Es una de las miembros, una de las casi fundadoras del CEPI con nosotros, gran compañera. También se encarga de la diplomatura de Asuntos Humanitarios que saca el CEPI desde la UBA, así que Denise, todo tuyo, y muchísimas gracias por estar acá con nosotros.
Muchas gracias, Luciana. Thank you, Susan. Y gracias a los que nos acompañan hoy en la audiencia. La verdad que esperamos aportar, como bien decía Luciana, un poco más a lo que ya venimos trabajando. Y mi presentación va a ser bastante breve, con el objeto de hacer una introducción sobre el tema que nos convoca en el encuentro de hoy, en los próximos 2 encuentros, sobre abuso y explotación sexual, o SEA, por sus siglas en inglés, en contextos de misiones de paz, desde una mirada académica. ¿Por qué consideramos que es necesario empezar a abordar y a potenciar esta mirada académica sobre estas cuestiones? Bueno, porque entendemos que los académicos y las académicas que nos dedicamos al estudio de las relaciones internacionales, especialmente desde una perspectiva de derechos humanos y de género, donde me incluyo, al igual que muchas colegas, no podemos constituirnos como actores pasivos al respecto, porque de hecho nosotros tenemos y poseemos herramientas analíticas, teóricas suficientes para construir un conocimiento objetivo y serio en el estudio de este objeto de estudio y así visibilizar esta problemática. Y tratando de hacer una cronología, es seguro afirmar que esta problemática no es un hecho reciente. De hecho, los primeros registros de denuncias por explotación y abuso sexual perpetrado por agentes que eran parte y son parte de las misiones de paz se remontan a principios de los años 90, es decir, hace 30 años, en el contexto justamente de las misiones de paz vinculadas a Bosnia y Herzegovina y Kosovo. Si bien esto generó una gran consternación a nivel internacional, donde la comunidad internacional comenzó a reconocer el impacto de la SEA cometidos contra mujeres y niñas durante los conflictos armados específicamente, se insistía y se persistía en la responsabilidad individual de los perpetradores, es decir, no se aludía a una responsabilidad institucional al respecto. De todas formas, con estos antecedentes podemos nombrar grandes avances normativos, como bien mencionaba Luciana anteriormente, que es el informe Brahimi y la resolución 1325. Sin hacer mucha especificación al respecto, pero sí para dar una mirada amplia al respecto, es que estos dos avances normativos ponían el foco en dos cosas: exigir mayor disciplina en el personal destinado a estas misiones, e incorporar una perspectiva de género transversal. Y es lo más importante al respecto, porque esto comenzó a decantar en otras facultades y en los códigos de conducta de los agentes que formaban parte de estas misiones de paz. Y aún así, a pesar de estos esfuerzos, y entre muchos otros, las denuncias por SEA seguían apareciendo, y haciendo un recorrido también en estas denuncias de los últimos años que se vinieron registrando, no fue hasta el año 2004 que varios medios de comunicación internacional, como podemos decir CNN, comenzaron a realizar sus propias investigaciones y dieron a conocer al mundo casos de SEA específicamente en el Congo. Y aún así, también 4 años después, nos encontramos con informes de varias organizaciones no gubernamentales a escala internacional, como Save the Children, que publican en el 2008 el informe No One to Turn To, que es A Nadie Quien Recurrir. Esta información que comienzan a recopilar y que podemos analizar desde la academia, en algún punto fue un desborde sobre la opinión pública y también, consecuentemente, a la comunidad internacional, porque se dieron a conocer directamente los testimonios de víctimas, es decir, se comenzó a tomar una dimensión de esta problemática a partir de la voz de las propias víctimas, y de alguna manera, y creo que esto es lo más importante desde una mirada académica, es que se comenzó a exponer un claro patrón de conducta que nos permite a los académicos y académicas sistematizar y esquematizar nuestro trabajo de investigación respecto a este objeto de estudio. Entonces, como parte y miembros y miembros de este mundo académico, no podemos omitir esto, porque ya nos encontramos con varias variables de análisis que nos permite sistematizar, justamente como nombraba anteriormente, este objeto de estudio. Es decir, nos encontramos con las mismas variables, que son el mismo contexto que se produce esta problemática, es decir, contextos de ayuda humanitaria, misiones de paz, y no solo en un caso en particular, sino que nos encontramos con misiones de paz en Angola, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Burundi, Camboya, Congo, Costa de Marfil, Haití, como va a nombrar Susan seguramente en su exposición, Guinea, Timor del Este, etcétera, etcétera. También otra variable es que son los mismos perpetradores, es decir, que nos encontramos con los mismos victimarios. Y también, que no es poca cosa, siempre hay una direccionalidad en las mismas víctimas, niñas y mujeres y adolescentes, en ese contexto de vulnerabilidad total. Y hay un mismo mecanismo de violencia que es SEA, justamente, abuso sexual y explotación sexual. Y yo voy a tomar 2 definiciones específicamente, que no son definiciones que yo elegí al azar, sino que fueron publicadas en el 2003 en el Boletín Oficial del Secretario General respecto a esta temática específicamente, que es cuando se dice explotación sexual, nosotros estamos hablando de que hay un abuso real o tentativo desde una posición de vulnerabilidad, y hay una relación de poder diferencial o de confianza, es decir, hay un victimario que tiene una capacidad y una relación de poder mucho mayor que pone a la víctima en una situación de extrema vulnerabilidad. Y hay un objeto, un fin sexual para obtener beneficios económicos, ¿no? Hay una transacción completamente desigual. Y abuso sexual es lo que tiene que ver con la intrusión física real o amenaza de naturaleza sexual. Y justamente estas son 2 definiciones que a mí me parecieron sumamente interesantes, porque nos permite entender que desde lo institucional hay una contemplación de esta problemática, pero hay algo que va más allá, que desde la academia tenemos que empezar a ver, que no es suficiente el reconocimiento institucional, sino que hay algo que va desde el vamos, desde la formación, y que es necesario comenzar a tomar este objeto de estudio no como casos aislados, sino comenzar a analizar esto como un patrón, y hay una sistematización de alguna manera de la conducta que perpetúa un sistema de violación de los derechos humanos. direccionada a una parte de la población puntual en un contexto de conflicto o consecuente, o es la conducción de este, y lamentablemente se produce dos cosas que me parece que desde la academia no se puede omitir, que es un proceso de revictimización, es decir, las mujeres y niñas en contextos de conflictos armados ya sabemos que se encuentran en una situación de vulnerabilidad total, y ya sabemos que no afecta por igual que a otras poblaciones. Y aparte, con estos casos de SEA, se produce una nueva revictimización, es decir, ya nos encontramos con otro paso que me parece que se repite y es necesario comenzar a analizar desde las distintas herramientas teóricas y las distintas herramientas analíticas que poseemos los expertos y expertas en esta mirada, desde una mirada académica, por supuesto. De todas formas, yo no me voy a detener mucho más en esto, pero me parece que es importante comenzar desde la mirada académica, desde el mundo académico y expertos y expertas como somos de las relaciones internacionales, entender que hay algo que nos supera, que más allá de los avances normativos y más allá de esta estructuración desde la norma internacional, y que existe una exigencia en el régimen de disciplina y la preparación de los agentes para las misiones de paz y para los agentes que forman parte de los contingentes de ayuda humanitaria, hay algo que se nos escapa, y eso es el foco que debemos hacer para poder comprender aún más y poder visibilizar esta problemática, como bien decía al principio. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Denise. Yo lo único que sí, a veces nada, también lo quiero comentar, ¿no? Lo vemos siempre como en situaciones de vulnerabilidad, obviamente a jóvenes, adolescentes, niñas y mujeres, pero también puede estar en situaciones de vulnerabilidad niños y adolescentes varones en estas cuestiones, y que seguramente hay estudios que así espero lo vayan a comprobar en diferentes lugares del mundo. Vamos a presentar e introducir a la doctora Susan Bartels. Ella es de Canadá, de la Universidad de Queens. Ella es médica en situaciones de emergencia y hace foco en sus investigaciones en el impacto a las mujeres y a los niños por las crisis humanitarias, ¿sí? I'm going to introduce Susan as Susan Bartel. She is a clinician scientist and Canadian research chair in humanitarian health equity at Queen's University. In addition to practicing emergency medicine, she conducts global public health research focused on how women and children are impacted by humanitarian crisis. Lo acabo de decir en inglés para que Susan sepa cómo la estamos presentando. Dear Susan, thank you very much for your time and for all the things that you have been studying and focusing on your research on Congo and Haiti. We would love to listen to what you are going to tell us about your research on those places, especially in Haiti, that we have a lot of contingents there and people working very hard and very professionally there. So it's a pleasure to have you here, and we want to, I don't know, to just listen to you and to get involved in this way of analyzing this problem from an academic perspective, okay? So Susan, this is all your audience. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Gracias. I apologize that I won't be able to speak in Spanish this morning, but I will try to speak slowly. I'm going to share my screen and hope that technology will cooperate. Okay, is that okay? You can see just the one slide?
Yes.
Yes, great. And you can hear me okay?
Yes, great.
Okay. Perfect. Well, thank you again for the opportunity to share our research and to engage with this group on such an important topic. So as mentioned, I'm going to present mixed methods research from both Haiti and the Democratic Republic of Congo that we have been conducting since 2017. I have a feeling that we just had a wonderful introduction to the topic, which is great because I hadn't planned to say too much by way of background. This is my only slide. But so as you know, the UN deploys peace support operations to conflict and post-conflict settings. And these settings are most often characterized by political instability as well as high levels of poverty. And I think that both of those issues are important. The mandate of peace support operations broadly is to maintain security and to protect civilians. Yet, as we know, the reputation of many peace support operations has been marred by allegations over the years of sexual exploitation and abuse perpetrated by peacekeepers against women and girls in the local host community. Throughout the presentation, I will refer to sexual exploitation and abuse as SEA, as a shorter form, and the two contexts as mentioned are Democratic Republic of Congo, which I'll refer to as DRC or Congo, as well as Haiti. So we recognized that there was very little literature from the perspective of women and girls who had experienced peacekeeper perpetrated SEA, and very little was known from an empirical perspective about the outcomes and the experiences of children who were conceived by peacekeeper fathers and born to local mothers. Certainly the media had picked up the issue. There were a number of reports. And what had been written academically was more from the legal perspective. So as a physician and public health practitioner, my lens was really from that aspect, although members of our team are historians, lawyers, and political scientists. So we undertook the research with three broad objectives. We wanted to understand the experiences of host community women and girls who had experienced SEA perpetrated by peacekeeping personnel. We were also very interested in the outcomes of peacekeeper fathered children. So again, fathered by foreign peacekeepers who often leave the country at some point and born to local mothers. And in Haiti, these children are referred to as petits ministres or little peacekeepers. They're also sometimes referred to as petits casques bleus or the little blue helmets. And throughout the presentation, there are some slides where you'll see petits ministres. So again, this is referring to peacekeeper fathered children. And finally, we wanted to look at, we wanted to investigate how women go about accessing support, reparation, and justice for these wrongdoings. I'll start briefly with the methods. Essentially, it was a very similar study using a similar survey in both Haiti and Congo. The Haiti data was collected in 2017 and the Congo data in 2018. In both settings, it was a cross-sectional study using a survey. In each context, the data was collected with very close collaboration with local partners. In the DRC, our two partners were Sophie Paddy and Maracuja. And in Haiti, our partners were COFAVIV, Bureau d'Avocats International, and ETS. So I want to acknowledge their important role in this work. We undertook this research using a platform or a narrative capture tool called SenseMaker that may not be as familiar to some of you. So SenseMaker is based on the premise that storytelling is a natural way for people to convey complex information about their experiences. And it's a way that people make sense of the world around them. These are the anecdotes or the stories that we might tell our family members or our friends about what happened to us. Sort of like, I was at work today and somebody came to me and said this. So that sort of thing about our experiences. The stories are solicited by posing a prompt. And the prompt is very broad. So I've written in yellow at the bottom of this slide one of the prompts that we used. Essentially, the prompt said, share a story about what it's like to be a woman or girl who lives in this community and interacts with peacekeepers. And that's how open and broad it was. And people could share whichever story they wanted. It could be positive, it could be negative, it could be about SDA, it could be about something else. So after recording a brief, audio recording a brief narrative, the participant then interprets their own experiences. And this is important because it reduces the interpretation bias that is inherent if we as researchers try to interpret the experiences of somebody else. And I think that's particularly relevant when you're doing cross-cultural research. SenseMaker also avoids direct questioning. So again, we did not ask about SEA. We did not ask about sexual interactions of any nature. We did not ask about peacekeeper fathered children. Instead, this tool allows the experiences to flow naturally from the broader lived experiences. And because it doesn't ask direct questions, we also believe that it tends to reduce social desirability bias. So there are two main types of SenseMaker questions, interpretation questions. The one that you see here, this triangle asks, was the interaction, in the story business, friendly, or relationship? And on a tablet, using their finger or a little pen, the participant will pull this indicator over and they can answer anywhere in this triangle that they choose. If they put the indicator all the way up here at the top by business, the program will quantify that 100% for business, 0% for friendly, and 0% for relationship. If, on the other hand, they put it directly between friendly and business, see right here, the program would quantify that 50% business, 50% friendly, and 0 relationship. And finally, if a participant left the marker directly in the middle of the triangle, the program would quantify it 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And this would indicate that the story was an equal mix of all three. For each question, there is a non-applicable button, which can also be used if a participant prefers not to answer. And then the second type of question to orient you to briefly is this slider question. So here participants were asked, in the interaction shared, who had power and control? Was it the UN peacekeeper or was it the woman and girl? Again, the participant can use their finger or a tablet pen to pull the marker in either direction. So it's a continuous scale. In addition to using the SenseMaker survey, we also did follow-up qualitative interviews. So any woman or girl who shared a first-person story about having sexual interactions with a peacekeeper was asked if she would like to do a more in-depth follow-up interview. And you'll note that I said first person because the story shared with SenseMaker could have been somebody else's story. So I could tell a story that was about my sister. I could tell a story that was about my friend. I could tell a story about my neighbor. And we did interview men. So men could share stories about how women in their lives and their communities had interacted with peacekeepers. So just to be clear that these are not all first-person stories, but rather could have been about somebody else. So in Haiti, in the follow-up, more in-depth qualitative work, we had 18 interviews, one-on-one interviews, 15 focus group discussions, and in DRC we had 113 in-depth interviews. And in DRC, we actually interviewed peacekeeper fathered children as well. And to the best of our knowledge, this is some of the first data, impaired data from peacekeeper fathered children. So children from the ages of 6 to 19 were interviewed, 2 different surveys, one for the younger age groups that involved age appropriate activities such as drawing a picture of one's family and asking them to interpret that, and then a slightly more advanced but still age appropriate survey for the adolescent children. Okay, so hopefully that gives some idea of the methods. I'll move on to the results, and I will share both some qualitative and some quantitative data. So this shows where we interviewed in Haiti. So we have just over 2,500 self-interpreted stories about engaging with, interacting with, or hosting peacekeepers. Of those, 265 were about peacekeeper fathered children. Another 321 were about SEA, and there were almost 300 on cholera. As you can see from the map, we did interview in the capital region of Port-au-Prince, but also in the south, on the north coast, as well as the Central Plateau. So reasonable representation throughout the country. In DRC, we have just over 2,800 self-interpreted stories. And of these, just over 1,100 were about mentioned or were about peacekeeper-fathered children, and over 2,000 were about sexual abuse and exploitation. And we chose locations that were all in the east of the country, which has been more conflict affected, has faced more insecurity. The bases were all purposely chosen. So we chose bases that were staffed, larger bases that were staffed over a period of years. These are the demographics from Haiti. Just briefly, probably the thing that will jump out to you is that there were way more male participants. 71% of the participants were male in Haiti. And we recognized that this was the case as we were collecting the data because we were monitoring it as it came in. And despite attempts on behalf of the research team to remedy this and to approach and enroll more women, it was unsuccessful. So it is somewhat interesting that men had so much to say about an issue that primarily affects women. Otherwise, I would just point out that the sample was relatively young, mostly under the age of 35. Most were unmarried. And I would say that in general, our sample was more educated than probably the average, than what is the average in Haiti. In DRC, fortunately, we did not have the issue with the disproportionate participation of men. Here it was much more even, but again, the sample was relatively young with 77% under the age of 35, and 25% had at least some university education, which is significantly more educated than would be the average in DRC. So I think it's important to keep those in mind for interpretation of the results. So I'll present three major themes. The first is poverty. The second is how sexual interactions were perceived many times as being helpful. And the third is about how those affected went about seeking support and reparations. So I'll start with poverty. So this is a data point from the DRC, and participants were asked, so they share their story. The story can be about whatever they want. And the first question of interpretation around the story was, what is this story about? And this triangle is telling us that 60% of participants responded that their story was about poverty. And you may recall from the earlier slide that a high proportion of these stories were also about sexual abuse and exploitation. Now, because this is mixed methods, when we work live with the data, as we hover over either of these dots, the story that accompanied that data point pops up. And so it really allows us to use the narrative to interpret why people may have responded in the way that they did. So I'll share one quote from this poverty corner. So this female participant said, "We had a habit of going to the MONUSCO camp when we were still prostitutes. We specifically had to go there every day to have sex with men in exchange for money because we are from poor families. Since poverty was very extreme, parents were dying, then we could go to MONUSCO for that." So this is one example of a quote from a young woman who responded that her story was about poverty. The slider questions, the data is presented as these bar histograms, where the height of the bar represents the number of people who responded. And so the numbers are given here in the top. This is the question that asks, who had power and control in the interaction that was shared in the story. And you can see that most respondents replied that the Munista agent, the peacekeeper, had power and control. But we were very interested in this subset over here where the woman or girl was felt to have power or control. And the differences in the stories that's in red, we have the stories that were about peacekeeper fathered children, and these were other stories not about peacekeeper fathered children. And the difference in who responded on this end, whether it was the woman or girl that had power and control, was statistically significant with a p-value of less than 0.05 between the two groups. So we were interested in these outliers. And again, we can go back to the data to understand why people may have responded. So this male participant in Haiti said, Munista with the ladies is because the ladies were trying to feed themselves, so they ended up in such a situation. They offer themselves to Munista so that they can get something in return. If it wasn't for hardship, the ladies would never have done these things with the Munista. So it's about women and girls having control, but very much about poverty, again, as you can see. Okay, I'll move on to a perception that the sexual interactions were helpful. So this is a data point from Haiti where participants were asked if the interaction in the story was business in nature, whether it was friendly or whether it was considered a relationship. Again, in red, we have the stories that were about peacekeeper fathered children, and in blue, we have all other stories. Each of these lighter dots that you see represents where a single participant left their indicator when they interpreted their story. The larger dots that you see here, hopefully you can see my pointer, but the larger dots that you see here are the geometric means for each of the groups. And around the geometric mean, you have a 95% confidence ellipse. And if the 95% confidence ellipses do not overlap, we conclude that the subgroups responded in a statistically different way on this question. So what this triangle is telling us is that stories that were about peacekeeper fathered children were much more likely to be interpreted as being relationships, as opposed to other stories that were interpreted as being about business. And, you know, although we would consider most of these interactions to be abusive and or exploitative, it's just interesting that women in particular viewed them to be relationships and did not necessarily perceive that they were being exploited. Again, we can go back to a quote. So this is from a woman who interpreted her story as being about a relationship. She said, "I have a child fathered by Munista member. We were still together while I was pregnant. Then his tour of duty ended. He went back to his country. Now I have to be the one to educate this child to take care of his health and shelter." It was a recurrent theme in both Haiti and DRC of peacekeepers being repatriated or deployed to another base or location if a pregnancy or a sexual relationship came to be known. And this seemed to be to the detriment of mothers and to children. This again shows the geometric means with the 95% confidence intervals. Again, any rings that don't overlap are statistically significant. This question asked if the UN peacekeeper was able to offer protection, was in a position of authority, or was able to offer financial support. And you'll notice that most people are responding closer to that he was able to offer financial support. We've disaggregated this data by age, and we were particularly interested in the adolescents because we do know that adolescents are sometimes targeted for SEA. And very interestingly, the adolescents, those aged 13 to 17, were more likely to respond that the peacekeeper offered protection. And we've spent hours going through these stories trying to understand in what way the peacekeeper was perceived to have been offering protection. And it seemed to have come down to financial or material gain in exchange for sex. Most of the interactions were about sex. And this is one example of a quote from a teenager in Congo. "I was going out with a MUNISCO agent. He was not forcing me to have sex with him, but it was with my consent as he was providing me with money." So very interesting that even underage girls who do not technically have the ability to give consent for sexual relations with men, and so this represents a criminal act, they did not themselves perceive this to be harmful necessarily. And finally, I'll move on to support and reparations. So the quotes that I've chosen for support and reparations come from the qualitative data. So this is a quote from a female, a woman in Congo, and she said, "I went to MUNISCO with the child when the child was 4 years old. While reporting, I asked them to help me to be in touch with him for his child, as I was burdened by the child's responsibilities and charges. They asked me to come back after 1 month to get food. They gave me rice, beans, cooking oil. The next month they did likewise, but the third year they chased me and asked me to open a case elsewhere." And we saw probably more so in DRC that there's a whole mechanism of informal reporting whereby affected women and girls go to either the soldier that has been involved in the sexual interaction or his superior, or to the UN more broadly. But rather than a formal report that goes to the Conduct and Discipline Unit, it's managed locally, often by providing her with small amounts of money or with food. I have a similar themed quote from Haiti. This Haitian woman said, "These people have the means. They choose not to do anything for these kids. And they knew that they made us go all the way to Port-au-Prince to do DNA testing." At the time, there was a high-level Uruguayan officer who came to do the testing. Every time they say there is money to compensate us, nothing. Still nothing ever came through. Since 2014, we haven't heard anything, except they called us on the phone to say that the result was positive. So this woman had heard back from her DNA testing, but many of the participants who had brought their children forward for DNA testing had never received the results. And it's unclear at what level those results were hung up, whether it was at the troop contributing country, the national military, or at the UN. So just to pull it all together, I'm eager to have some discussion about these results. What was very clear was the cycle of poverty, that education and economic opportunities are greatly lacking for women and girls in places like Haiti and DRC. This creates an economic need. To meet their basic needs, some of these women and girls engage with sexual relationships with peacekeepers, particularly in contexts where access to contraception is limited. It's inevitable that some pregnancies result. In our data, it's pretty clear that the peacekeeper is almost always sent away once the pregnancy is discovered. In many cases, women and girls seek support from the UN. Sometimes they are successful in getting small amounts of informal support. Other times they aren't. But inevitably, this leaves the mother in a more compromised position. So it was poverty that often led these women to engage in sexual interactions. And then for those who are left to raise a child, they are left in exacerbated poverty. And we do have stories of women who say that they engaged in more transactional sex with additional peacekeepers in order to meet the needs of their children, of their peacekeeper fathered children. Also, just to point out the environment of impunity, which has also been well documented in the literature. So I think from the perspective of these women and girls in the local context, the peacekeepers, foreign peacekeepers, are relatively well off. Functional immunity in the host community exists. Sexual interactions happen. Disciplinary action. The national militaries may fail to act. The UN has no authority over the national militaries for discipline, and this cycle continues. So to summarize, I think it was interesting that the sexual interactions were not necessarily perceived as exploitative or abusive. Poverty is such a key underlying driver, and while we knew that before, I think that the data highlights some of the more nuanced ways that this plays out in reality. Most cases of sexual exploitation and abuse go unreported, at least formally unreported, but there seems to be a network of informal reporting. And in many cases, the response on the UN's part, from the perspective of repatriating that soldier as soon as possible, is detrimental to the woman and child. In terms of our future research, we have considered offering DNA testing to women raising peacekeeper fathered children in Haiti and DRC, because we know that some of them never received their the DNA testing that was conducted through the UN or through the national military. And this would not be to identify the individual father, but rather to try to see if we could identify which country the child's DNA comes from, and use that as an advocacy tool at the level of the UN and at the level of troop contributing countries to say, you know, this child in Congo has, for example, Uruguayan DNA. If the science is there to allow us to pinpoint it to a country, I'm not sure it is. We are also interested in interviewing the peacekeepers, because currently we only have the perspective, we only have half the story. We have the perspective of affected women and girls, and we would very much like to interview peacekeepers. And this is something that we've been trying to do for the last year or two. I think that may be helpful in informing future training initiatives. To end, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues who are mostly here in Canada at Queen's University and at York University, but also in the United Kingdom at the University of Birmingham. The research was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, as well as by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And again, I would like to thank our local partners. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Susan. It was wonderful to understand how you carry on these two different scenarios and two different well-known peacekeeping activities. Let me just make one question myself, and then we are going to have lots of questions, I think. What do you think were your major challenges in pursuing this research, this whole investigation? Your challenges in going and in making this happen?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of logistical challenges. You know, my research traditionally has been in settings like Haiti and DRC, so I embrace them happily because this is what I've chosen to do. I think it's key to find the right local partners, because you rely on them so much to guide the research, to ensure that it's done in an ethical and sensitive and culturally appropriate way. So it's important to find the right partners. Just travel around the country, you know, lack of internet at times to upload the data, concerns for safety of the local interview team who goes out to collect the data, you know, is sometimes an issue. And, you know, in Haiti, despite our best efforts, it was very difficult to engage with women, which I think was unfortunate. And I think it's multifactorial. I think because we interviewed in local public places. So the interviewers would go to the market or to where people were waiting for public transportation or to shops, and just ask people if they would like to tell a story about what it's like to host a peacekeeping mission. And I think that men were more likely to be out in those public spaces than women, who were probably busier at home with domestic chores. And when they were out in public, I think they were more often busy and with their children and less able to participate. So yeah, that was certainly a challenge for us. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Susan. I have a few questions on the chat. One question has to do with the language in which the research was carried out. I understand that, for example, in the case of Haiti, most of the local women would speak Creole and not necessarily English. So how was that done? And was that a particular challenge, I mean, to get translators, or how did you go about it?
Yes, gracias. So you're absolutely correct that most people in Haiti would speak Creole, and the data collection was done completely in Haitian Creole. And again, I think that comes back to the importance of having local partners, because the interview team was recruited from the local partners. And so they were Haitians themselves, Creole being their first language. So they were well positioned to conduct the surveys in their own language. In the DRC, we interviewed in both Lingala and Swahili, which are the two predominant languages in the East. So a fair amount of work to, the surveys were written in English, translated to Lingala, Swahili, and Creole, back translated for accuracy. And then, of course, the stories were recorded in Creole, Lingala, or Swahili, and we had to translate them back. We didn't have the budget, unfortunately, to translate all 2,500 stories or 2,800 stories. So we purposely chose stories that were on topics of interest. So if the story was about sexual abuse and exploitation, we chose to translate those. But yeah, it's a fair amount of data, and you always worry that there are nuances that perhaps are being missed when you're conducting research in a language that you don't understand. It is a challenge for sure.
Thank you, Susan. There is another question that has to do with the sexual exploitation and abuse of teens, but male teens. Was that shown at any point in the research, or you only conducted the research with women and girls? We understand the pregnancy factor and the peacekeeper fathering child factor, but the sexual exploitation and abuse of young men, was that highlighted at any point?
Yes, yeah, it's an important question because, of course, it's not just women and girls who are affected by sexual abuse and exploitation. It was highlighted, particularly in Haiti, much more so than in DRC. And we know that in Haiti, there was one particular unfortunate, tragic case of a young male that was raped, and in a very public way, and that it was put on the internet. And I think partially that may be responsible for why participants in Haiti talked about the involvement of men in SEA, but it was not limited to that case. We heard cases about men and boys being affected throughout the country. So it wasn't just in Port Salut, where I believe that case happened. And it was interesting. We're just in the process actually of writing a manuscript or revising a manuscript. What was really interesting was how the language differed. The language used by participants to describe SEA against women and girls versus men and boys. So when it was women and girls, the language was often, well, the peacekeeper had a chance to have sex with her, or she was getting money or food for sex. And there was almost as if there was some responsibility placed on the women and girls, whereas for boys, it was talked about as rape, as being completely unacceptable, that MUNISTA should leave Haiti as a result of men and boys being raped. And we didn't hear that outrage about SEA against women and girls, which led us to believe that there was transactional sex, at least, was sort of normalized. It was accepted. This is what women and girls, do to make ends meet. But for men and boys, there was outrage.
Thank you, Susan. Well, there is another question now. Where do you go forward with this research? Are you planning to move to other regions, or how would you go about it?
Yeah, I'm open to input. Please feel free to contact me if anybody is interested in collaborating or if you have ideas. As mentioned, we had the idea to do follow-up, to offer DNA testing to women and girls raising peacekeeper-fathered children. I don't know that that's feasible, particularly with COVID. And we also wanted to interview the peacekeepers. We actually had permission from the UN to interview peacekeepers last March of 2020, but then COVID hit and everything has been stalled. We have considered other locations, Sierra Leone, Liberia, West Africa, for instance. So South Sudan as well. Yeah. Remains to be seen, I think.
Thank you. I have one last question. And how do you think this information that, together with the work, well, Denise was mentioning, but all the research the universities and the academy do, can help train people prior to going on missions or prior to going to the conflicted areas, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. I haven't been privy to any of the actual training material that's delivered. I'm under the impression that the UN is doing a lot of training. There's pre-deployment, there's training when you arrive in country, there's training, at least in the DRC with MONUSCO, I think it's every 3 months, it's mandatory, and your supervisor makes sure that you're conducting the training. All of this leads me to believe that the way the training is conducted or the material being delivered is not being effective. And although I haven't sat in on the training, I envision a commander or somebody standing up there saying, basically, you shouldn't, rape the local women and you shouldn't have sex with young girls. And I would like to believe that on principle, everybody in the room would say, yes, I agree with that, I accept that. But I think the power dynamics and the power differential and how that plays out in real life is not well understood. And I believe that peacekeepers sometimes honestly believe that they're helping this young girl or this woman. And so what we have advocated is more contextual training, role playing perhaps around this. And we have so many stories now from the perspectives of women and girls. We have been in touch actually with a UN team about training to see if any of the data could be used to inform vignettes or little stories that the peacekeeper, because I think it's important to think these things through before you're actually in the setting where perhaps, a young woman or girl is approaching you and propositioning you for sex.
Thank you, Susan. I think that we have no more question or time, but it was very interesting to understand how you did the research, how you conducted the research, how were the results being delivered, and the key points of how poverty and vulnerability, it's not only the reason, but the consequence also. So it's like a very difficult situation. And as you pointed it out just right now, it's very important to understand that it's not only the way we trained and we do the pre-developed training programs, but it also to be informed and to actually be concerned on how they conduct themselves during the mission. But it's not something that they don't know beforehand. Okay, so thank you very much for the information you gather, the information you share with us. Thank you for your time. Thank everybody in the room. And we expect to have some new ways and views next Wednesday when we were going to talk about this with the UN conduct and discipline and how they do, because I know that they do, and our nationals, that they also are involved in national investigations of SEA. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody in the room, and hopefully see you next week at the same channel at 11 a.m. in the morning in Buenos Aires time. Thank you very much. and have a great time.